The morning sun stretched its golden light across the wide lawns of the sprawling mansion that stood proudly at the top of the hill, a symbol of wealth, power, and influence. Yet inside its walls there was a silence that money could not fix. A silence tied to the quiet suffering of young Daniel, the only son of Mr. Richard Hallington, a self-made millionaire who had built his empire with grit, shrewdness, and an unrelenting hunger to rise above everyone else. But when fate had dealt him a cruel hand by making his boy blind since birth, no amount of money, no number of specialists, no expensive treatments across Europe or America could give back the sight his son never had. And it was this tragedy that softened even the hardest edges of the ruthless businessman. Daniel was only 10, yet he carried himself with a calmness far beyond his years. Perhaps because he had never seen the colorful chaos of the world. Perhaps because his other senses had been sharpened like fine instruments, his hearing so sensitive he could detect the gentle rustle of leaves in the garden, his smell so keen he could tell the maids apart, simply by the faint scent of their perfumes, and his heart so innocent that he trusted easily and loved deeply, without prejudice or pride. Among the many staff that worked in the Hallington mansion was Maria, an elderly black maid who had served the family for years, often overlooked by the wealthy guests and ignored by the arrogant elite. But within her beat a heart of compassion, wisdom and faith that had carried her through hardships that no one in that luxurious home could ever imagine. For she had once been a mother who lost her child to illness and a wife who had buried her husband far too early. And though life had tested her, she had never lost her belief in miracles, prayer, and the power of love. It was Maria who spent the most time with Daniel, telling him stories in the garden, guiding his little hands to feel the textures of the flowers, teaching him how to imagine colors he could not see, and whispering prayers over him when no one was watching. Though Mr. Hallington, skeptical and hardened by a lifetime of business negotiations, often dismissed such faith as childish nonsense, something servants used to comfort themselves when the real world was too harsh. But destiny has a way of weaving miracles into the lives of those least expecting it, and it began quietly on a summer afternoon when Daniel sat on the stone bench outside, his face tilted up to the sky as if he could somehow feel the warmth of the sun painting the clouds above, while Maria hummed an old hymn beside him, her hands busy shelling peas from a basket, when suddenly the boy whispered, "Maria, do you think God hears me when I ask him to let me see?" Her hands froze, her eyes watered, and though she wanted to give a simple, comforting answer, she felt something stir inside her, as though this moment was not ordinary, but a divine appointment. She put aside the basket, wiped her wrinkled hands on her apron, and gently placed one palm over Daniel's closed eyes, her voice trembling as she began to pray, whispering words of hope, of faith, of surrender to a power far beyond human comprehension. Daniel didn't move. He simply sat there breathing softly, and though nothing changed immediately, Maria felt a strange warmth pulse through her hand, like a current of life that was not her own, and for a fleeting second she wondered if she had imagined it. But Daniel shifted slightly and whispered, "It feels warm, Maria." At that exact moment, standing on the balcony above, Mr. Hallington happened to see the scene unfold. His son sitting so still, with the old maid's weathered hand pressed to his face. And instead of anger, he felt a wave of helplessness wash over him, a reminder of how powerless he was, despite all his wealth. And though he muttered under his breath that it was foolish, he did not stop her, for deep down he wanted desperately for any possibility, no matter how impossible, to give his son the sight of which he had been robbed. Days turned into weeks, and Maria continued her quiet ritual, always praying softly, always rubbing Daniel's eyes with a mixture of warm water and a homemade balm of herbs she said her grandmother had used back in her village, something Mr. Hallington mocked when he first discovered it, but he allowed it to continue when he saw Daniel's excitement each time. Maria whispered prayers over him, for the boy began to describe something strange, shadows, flashes, little sparks of light in the darkness that had once been absolute. At first, Mr. Hallington dismissed it as imagination, but one evening during dinner, Daniel suddenly turned his head toward the glowing chandelier and said, "It's bright, isn't it?" The entire room froze, the clink of silverware against china stopped, and Mr. Hallington nearly dropped his glass, demanding to know what Daniel meant. But the boy only repeated softly, "It's bright, brighter than anything I've ever felt." Doctors were called, specialists summoned from across the country, and all confirmed what seemed medically impossible. His eyes showed signs of stimulation, signs they had never seen before in a child who had been diagnosed with total blindness. The mansion was thrown into a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and cautious hope. And while Mr. Hallington scrambled to arrange more tests, Maria simply continued what she had always done, her faith unshaken, her heart steady, for she knew this was not her power, but something greater, something the world of millionaires and doctors could never measure in charts or scans. Still, tension grew between Mr. Hallington and Maria, for though he saw the improvement, he could not bear to admit that a humble maid, a woman whom society placed far beneath him, could hold the key to a miracle his billions could not buy. And in his pride, he insisted it was the doctors, the science, the expensive equipment, while, deep in his chest, a quieter voice told him otherwise, a voice he tried to silence. Meanwhile, Daniel's experiences grew more vivid. He began describing colors, though he had never been taught them. Visually, saying things like, "The grass feels green today," or "Maria, your song sounds red." And though his words confused the adults, Maria understood he was beginning to interpret sight in ways no one could explain. The impossible was unfolding in real time, and the millionaire, who once believed money could control every outcome, now stood powerless, watching as his son's world cracked open with light, guided not by wealth but by the gentle hands and unwavering faith of a black maid who believed in miracles when no one else would. And so Chapter 1 ends on this cliffhanger, as Mr. Hallington paces the marble floors of his mansion late into the night, torn between fear and awe, pride and humility, wondering if tomorrow his son would wake up seeing the world for the first time, and whether he himself was ready to face the truth that miracles do not come with a price tag. Dear viewers, if this story has touched your heart so far and you want to know what happens next in Daniel's journey, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because Chapter 2 will reveal the moment when something truly impossible changes everything forever. The following morning dawned with a tension in the air that none of the Hallington Mansion's residents could ignore, for though the sun rose as it always did, gilding the rolling lawns in gold and casting shadows across the marble pillars of the grand estate, there was an anticipation simmering quietly, as if every stone, every curtain, every breath within the walls knew that this day would mark the unraveling of something extraordinary. And at the heart of it was young Daniel, sitting upright in his bed, his eyes bandaged lightly from the doctor's last examination, his small fingers gripping the edge of his blanket with a strange mixture of fear and wonder, while Maria stood silently beside him, her lips moving in a prayer only she and God could hear. And Mr. Hallington paced the room with restless energy, a storm of disbelief and hope warring inside his chest. Daniel whispered, "Maria, I dreamed last night. There was light everywhere and voices and faces, but they were blurry." And Maria's heart trembled with both joy and fear, for she sensed that the veil of darkness that had covered his world was thinning faster than anyone realized. When the bandages were removed later that morning, Daniel blinked furiously, his eyelids fluttering like fragile wings as if unused to even the faintest suggestion of brightness. And for the first time in his life, shapes began to form, faint outlines of his father's tall figure, Maria's familiar presence, the golden glow of sunlight sneaking in through the drapes, though indistinct and confusing. They were real, undeniable, and Daniel cried out, "I can see something." That cry shook the mansion like an earthquake, echoing in every hall, every chamber, rattling the hearts of staff who had witnessed the boy stumbled through life, without sight, and for a moment even Mr. Hallington's pride collapsed. For tears he had long denied streamed down his cheeks as he fell to his knees before his son, whispering brokenly, my boy, yet in the back of his mind, the businessman in him wrestled with questions of how, why, what scientific anomaly or medical breakthrough could possibly explain this. And he immediately summoned a team of renowned specialists, men and women of science who arrived in polished cars and crisp suits, carrying machines and tests, probing and measuring, only to admit with hushed voices that what was happening to Daniel defied explanation. For his eyes were not supposed to respond. His optic nerves were declared non-functional since infancy, and yet here he was, describing shapes, naming shadows, pointing to the outline of a chair, and even smiling toward his father's blurred silhouette. The doctors, baffled and unsettled, suggested further research. But Maria stood firm, telling them softly, some things science cannot own. Statement that irritated Mr. Hallington deeply, for he could not bear the idea that the miracle unfolding in his home came from the faith of a maid he had long considered beneath his world of wealth and power. Still, Daniel's progress accelerated, as though every day peeled back another layer of darkness. Soon he was seeing colors for the first time, gasping at the green of the lawns outside his window, the dazzling blue of the summer sky, and the radiant red of Maria's headscarf, a color so bold and alive that he reached out to touch it, whispering, it's like fire, but gentle, and Maria laughed through tears, knowing the boy was experiencing what most people take for granted as though it were heaven's greatest treasure. Word of the miracle began to spread beyond the mansion walls, whispered among staff, then neighbors, then reporters who caught wind of an impossible story. Blind Millionaire's son regains sight, and soon cameras gathered outside the iron gates, journalists hungry for answers, scientists eager to stake a claim, pastors declaring divine intervention, skeptics scoffing at superstition, until Mr. Hallington found himself surrounded by a storm of public fascination, his home transformed into a stage for the world to question, debate, and marvel. But within the chaos, Daniel remained the pure heart of it all, running clumsily through the gardens, falling often but rising with laughter, naming colors, shapes, and eventually faces, the most precious of which was Maria's, for one afternoon, as she leaned over him, while guiding his hands through a basket of flowers. Daniel suddenly stopped, tilted his head, and said softly, Maria, you're beautiful, words that broke her heart into both joy and sorrow. For no one had ever told her that in her years of service, in her decades of being invisible to those above her, yet here was a child, seeing her for the first time, not just with his eyes, but with his soul. The impossible was no longer just about sight. It was about transformation for Mr. Hallington. Though still wrestling with pride, began to soften, forced to confront truths he had long buried, that money could not command miracles, that humility could teach him more than wealth ever had, and that his son's healing had come not from his billions but from the faith of a woman he had overlooked. Yet pride dies hard, and when reporters pressed him for explanations, he insisted publicly it was a medical phenomenon, downplaying Maria's role, calling her presence comforting but not causal, words that cut Maria deeply, though she bore them in silence. For she had not done what she did for recognition, but for love. And she knew in time truth always reveals itself. The climax came one stormy night when Daniel awoke screaming, clutching his head as if fire were behind his eyes, his sight seeming to flicker between clarity and darkness. And in panic, Mr. Hallington called for every doctor, every machine, every test, but nothing soothed the boy until Maria rushed in, pressing her palm once again gently over his eyes, whispering the same prayer she had spoken countless times. And immediately Daniel's cries quieted. His breathing slowed, and when he opened his eyes again, he saw, not in flickers or shadows, but in full, radiant clarity, the faces of his father and Maria side by side, one lined with fear, the other with faith. And he laughed through tears, crying out, I see you both. That moment shattered the last chains of denial in Mr. Hallington's heart. He collapsed into Maria's arms, whispering words he never thought he'd say. "Thank you for giving me my son," acknowledging at last that this miracle was not his to buy, not his to brand, but a gift born from love, humility and faith. From then on, life at the mansion changed. Maria was no longer just a maid, but family, honored and respected. Her seat at the dinner table no longer in the corner, but beside the boy whose life she had transformed. And Mr. Hallington himself, softened in business and in life, using his wealth not just to build empires, but to build lives, inspired by the miracle that taught him the limits of power and the boundlessness of grace. And as for Daniel, he grew into a young man with sight sharper than most, not because of the clarity of his eyes, but because of the wisdom of his journey. Forever grateful to the woman who believed when no one else did, and forever a reminder that sometimes the impossible is only the beginning of a greater story. And so, dear viewers, if this tale has moved your heart, if it has reminded you of the power of faith, humility, and love, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because more stories of transformation, hope, and impossible miracles await you right here, and your support helps us share them with the world.